Contra Krugman, episode 207.
Welcome to the podcast that takes apart Paul Krugman's New York Times column. Join us as Tom Woods and Bob Murphy teach economics by uncovering and dissecting the arrows of Krugman, Nobel Prize winner, newspaper columnist, and destroyer of nations. It's time for Contra Krugman.
Folks, the economic situation is getting pretty choppy. I think a recession's coming, and I would just like you to be aware of your alternative options. Now, I've written a guide on Bitcoin. It's free, PDF. Go to understandingbitcoin.us to learn about that. And then if you're interested in what's called IBC, check out thecaseforibc.com to learn more about using, believe it or not, whole life insurance as a cash flow management tool that will help you somewhat shield yourself from the turbulent times ahead. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Contra Krugman. It's Bob and Brian for another... Oh, wait a minute. Brian. That's right, folks. Tom's not here. Don't worry. I didn't get rid of him. He's traveling. What we have is a special guest for you, Brion McClanahan. He's also the host of the Brion McClanahan Show, which is not surprising, and a lecturer at Liberty Classroom. So, Brian, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Bob. I appreciate it. I hope I can pinch hit for Tom and do a good job. This is big shoes to fill.
Yes, exactly. So what we're going to do here, folks, is we're going to cover a Krugman column. Now, remember, for some of you who may have missed the announcement, we've switched to a once every 2 weeks schedule for Krugman in order to hopefully get juicier columns on average. And so this one is from September 30th, 2019, called Warren versus the Petty Plutocrats. Little alliteration there for you. And I will summarize the column, and then I will turn it over to Brian for his thoughts. So the subtitle, by the way, says, "Why do they hate her? It's mainly about their egos." And Krugman starts out saying Elizabeth Warren used to not be likable enough. That was the claim. It was a lazy take with a strong element of sexism. And yet now she's undeniably gaining in popularity. People are taking selfies with her. She's not ahead of Biden in the polls, at least as of when Krugman wrote this, but many of the prediction markets are saying she's got about a 50% chance of being the Democratic nominee. And now it turns out, Krugman says, that a lot of Wall Street tycoons, even ones who historically have contributed and supported the Democratic Party, are saying behind the scenes at least that, yeah, if Warren is the nominee, they're going to switch and throw their support behind Trump. And so the point of this column is Krugman's trying to figure out why is that. And he says, it might be, you might think, is it because of her wealth tax, where she wants to put a 2% tax on people who, on their wealth, an annual tax of $50 million or more. And Krugman says no, and this is a line he uses. For the only people who would be directly affected by her tax proposals are those who more or less literally have more money than they know what to do with. Having $1 million or two less wouldn't crimp their lifestyles. Most of them would barely notice the change, right? So that's his dismissal of the idea that maybe they're against her for financial reasons because she wants to take some of their wealth. And what it turns out, Krugman's theory is, he says, the point is that many of the super rich aren't satisfied with living like kings, which they will continue to do no matter who wins next year's election. They also expect to be treated like kings, lionized as job creators and heroes of prosperity and so forth, right? So his point is the plutocrats don't like the tone that Elizabeth Warren is using. They don't like being made the subject of public ire because she's criticizing them as if they're a malevolent force in society. And these people don't like that. They're already super rich, and they want to get respect on top of that, and Elizabeth Warren's not giving it to them. And so Krugman says that's the real reason behind the scenes they're thinking about throwing their support behind Trump. And Krugman makes a lot of allusions to FDR. He says, for example, Warren seems to be benefiting from these attacks. And he says, indeed, over-the-top attacks from the wealthy can sometimes be a political plus. That was certainly the case for FDR, who reveled in his plutocratic opposition. And then he's got a quote where FDR said, "They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred." All right, so that's the idea. And then Krugman wraps up with a sort of whimsical, I do worry, however, how Wall Streeters will take it if they go all out to defeat Warren and she wins anyway. Washington can bail out their balance sheets, but who can bail out their damaged psyches? All right, so that's Krugman's column. As we comment on it, feel free, Brian, if you wanted to if you had like specific quotes or whatever you wanted to respond to, you can go ahead and do that. But why don't we stop there, and I will at this point turn it over to you and just ask for what's your reaction to this?
Well, first of all, I mean, when you look at that last line, essentially what he's doing is setting these people up as snowflakes. I mean, this is this is the snow. These people are just a bunch of snowflakes. It's not, as you said, it's not about wealth. It's not about losing some of their wealth. It's all about how they feel about things. And so this is a typical, to me, progressive look at American society. But when you talk about these individuals, and I think one of the reasons before we came on, you mentioned the plutocrats, and Krugman likes to draw a lot of comparisons between the Gilded Age and this period. Of course, he calls this the second Gilded Age or the new Gilded Age. I think it's hilarious on the surface on what he's doing here. And I think one of the things that Krugman, he mentions in the column, where he says, look, Obama was actually pretty kind to these people. When we had all this regulation, these regulations were mild. There's nothing going on here. In fact, all these people have been really good to the wealthy for a long time. And so if we have to tax them at 2%, if we have to regulate, this is just okay. And when you go back, this is essentially based on the idea that all of these people, even going back to the 19th century, were somehow created by, or at least there's a myth that these people were not part of a process by which the United States was reconstructed economically after the war. And that would be, when you look at how these people were making a lot of their money, it was on government subsidies, land grants, central banking. So for people who are Austrian economists and others who look at this as, this is corporate welfare. And so what's happening here is these people are making a lot of money on the government. And then, of course, Krugman and others would say, well, I mean, that's okay, but we have to regulate on the other hand. And it's just amazing how we get into this back and forth on the real issue, which, of course, is government when it comes down to it. It's government's creating bubbles, or the Federal Reserve or central banking is creating all this problem. And then, of course, you have to have government riding in on the white horse, Elizabeth Warren or Paul Krugman or whoever it is, to come save the day and, of course, regulate and make it all better for everybody else. And I think that's the most shocking thing about Krugman in general and all the progressive economists, is that they just don't admit what the real issue is here.
Yeah, I agree entirely with that. And it is funny, too, how Krugman has to straddle this line between, like, oh, thank goodness we had Obama in there. And can you imagine if the Republicans had been in charge and all these, far-sighted. So it's like keep going back and forth between these progressives are really pushing through special legislation or whatever, and they're saving us from the ravages of the free market. But then when someone starts to complain and say, hey, these guys are radical, oh, no, this is just, this is common sense regulation. There's not a big deal. I mean, this is actually helpful to the bankers. And so it does seem like it depends what the situation is as to whether these people are progressive radicals or if they're just, oh, yeah, this is standard. Anybody would have done that in the White House. The other thing,
I mean, exactly.
Yeah, and why don't I just say before I forget, the way Krugman opens this is just so annoying to me. This is a typical thing where he says the dismissal of Elizabeth Warren, but when people were saying she wasn't likable enough to be president, it was always a lazy take with a strong element of sexism. No, right. The reason they were saying Elizabeth Warren wasn't likable enough is because she's not very likable. Like she's awkward and wooden. You know what I mean? Like I feel uncomfortable just watching footage of her. And the same thing with Hillary Clinton. And no, this idea that, Republicans hate women or whatever, if you ask the average Republican, what do you think of Margaret Thatcher? What are they going to say? That, oh, yeah, she shouldn't have been leading. No, they were, a lot of them were enthusiastic about Sarah Palin, so it's Condoleezza Rice, right? So it's not that Republicans are against women. And I don't remember a lot of liberal Democrats really praising Betsy DeVos. I remember they're demonizing her as this horrible person who wants to ruin education. So this idea that Republicans, if there's a woman up there that the Democrats are putting up who's awful on several dimensions and the Republicans don't like her, that's sexism. That's what it is. Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's absolutely ridiculous. The only one I think it's been more awkward to watch someone in power recently would be Theresa May when she tried to dance. When you watch that. You haven't seen Theresa May? No. Go out and look up Theresa May dancing. It's even worse than watching Elizabeth Warren make a speech. You're right. I mean, she's very awkward and still. I don't even know how to describe it. It's the most troubling thing to watch. And then, of course, my take on Warren is that she always has a plan for that. If you notice, every time something happens, she has a plan for that. It's I have a plan for this. I have a plan for that. And it's
so
become
a
catchphrase. Like among her supporters, even on Twitter, yeah,
I have a plan for that. You can't get around the fact that, I mean, somebody couldn't like her because, oh my gosh, if there's somebody sneezes in Alabama, well, I have a plan to stop sneezing in Alabama. Here it is. So it's not about unconstitutional government. It's not about, overreach. It's all just because she's a woman. You're right. I mean, Krugman starts, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because it's so funny. I laughed from the first sentence, because this is what you get out of these people. It was the same thing with Obama, of course. Nobody likes Obama because of his race. I mean, my gosh, you're talking about, as you said, Republicans. I'm sure all these Republicans, because of race, didn't like Clarence Thomas, right? I mean, this is a guy that's lionized across the Republican Party, but it's all about race, or it's all about
and they loved Colin Powell, at least when he was doing marching according to their tune and so forth. So yeah, it's clearly or like Walter Williams or Thomas Sowell. Are they doing okay in conservative circles? You know what I mean? Like it's actually they are probably held up to an even higher level of adulation, because oh wow, the Republicans get to show see
right.
You made a good point. I didn't even think of that a minute ago when you said how Krugman's saying all these investment bankers are snowflakes in his worldview. And I think a lot of times what Krugman does is project stuff. Like, not so much in this one, it's not as obvious, but in other columns where he's writing about like other academics, it's eerie. Like, it makes me uncomfortable when it's so obvious to me that Krugman is describing himself to a T, and he's apparently not aware of that fact. You know what I mean? So here too, I wonder how much of this is just Krugman's trying to understand what's motivating these people. Well, she's going to take away millions of dollars a year from them. Nah, that's probably not it. No, what it is they don't like criticism. I worked at a financial firm in Nashville, and the guy who was there had come from Wall Street. And he was telling me just how the environment up there, where, guys would march into your office in the morning and throw the thing on your desk and say, "Get this effing done by lunchtime, you effing," Right. And the idea that these guys like, "Oh, I don't want Elizabeth Warren to criticize me. It hurts my feelings." Like, I don't really think that's it. And that they would take such a monumental decision as to switch who they're supporting to be the president based on that. You know what I mean? Like that's, you would wonder, how could someone who's that fragile and make such poor decisions? Because again, in Krugman's narrative, they're hurting themselves. He especially, Let me just read this one. I didn't read it. It is amazing to me how Krugman just throws these things around that, I don't want to sound like I'm a PC policeman here, but that are offensive, I would think. He says, "So what would make the very wealthy, even some Jewish billionaires who should have a very good idea of the likely consequences of right-wing dominance, support Trump over someone like Warren?" Right? So Krugman's been throwing these lines around recently, saying if you're Jewish and you support Trump, you're basically a collaborator with the Nazis. I mean, that's a provocative thing to say.
Right.
So
can you imagine if you said that? If you wrote a column and you said that, I mean, my gosh, you would be excoriated for that. I mean, Krugman can get away with it.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah. So it's, but yeah, so the idea that people would be that short-sighted and make such foolish emotional decisions, and yet they're also billionaires, that just doesn't seem to mesh in my mind. You know what I mean? Like, they had a lot of these guys weren't all heirs who just, their daddy handed them billions of dollars. Like, they had to earn it out there, and you can say they did cutthroat and things and based on state favors and what have you. I'm not saying they all were paragons of free market innovation, but the idea that they make stupid, irrational, self-defeating decisions based on their feelings, that doesn't ring true to me.
Well, you said this is Krugman's projecting. He's an academic, as you said, and academics have this kind of thin skin. I mean, think about how many people that are academics. If you criticize one thing that they do, they just go ballistic. They can't handle it. They have such thin skin, and so Krugman is that way. I mean, the reaction that he's had to this podcast has been hilarious. And his supporters to this, it's all been funny because all these people are so thin-skinned that they can't handle any type of criticism. And as soon as you do, you're going to get this, as you said, that line. I mean, I saw that line too, and I thought, how's he doing? How does he get away with that? Because he's Paul Krugman, and Paul Krugman is held to a different standard than Bob Murphy or Tom Woods or anybody else. And so, one of the things I find interesting about this too is I actually feel sorry for the Occupy Wall Street people, and they know something's wrong with, and if you get into a situation of free market, and they know that the game is rigged, and of course it is. I mean, this is the Hamiltonian system that's been foisted on the United States. They know that there's something going on here, but they look at it entirely wrong. I mean, this is, well, we're just going to have a massive regulatory system. We're going to take everybody's money. It's Huey Long. Everybody over $1 million is just going to get taxed to 100%. Or you have this land tax idea from people like Henry George back in the 19th century. Any profit over 100% is just ours. And the real issue, of course, is that there is no real free market solution that anyone talks about. Well, my gosh, maybe if we didn't have central banking like we have, maybe things would be a little better. Maybe if we didn't subsidize every single big businessman under the sun and have tariffs and maybe things would be better. But that's not what they do. It's not recognizing the cancer, the disease, and they're just coming up with some kind of stupid Band-Aid to stick over it, when the real problem is much more structural and fundamental. So I actually feel sorry for people like Paul Krugman and the Occupy Wall Street at times, because they just don't get it. And it's funny to me.
Well, I wonder if there's a distinction to be made. I think Krugman does, quote, get it in the sense, Krugman's part of the 1%. Mm-hmm. Krugman is, and it's funny that I've seen ways that he tries to get out of that. You know what I mean? Because now he realizes how awkward that is for him, and he tries to say, well, no, what the 1% was always about. Like, he tries to argue it was really about the 0.1%. I'm not even making that up, Brian. Like he said, that was it was a convenient simplification. You know what I mean? but really, if you go look at the numbers, what we're talking about is it's always people who are richer than he is. So I am more cynical about him, whereas you're right. The people who were camping out in a park or something and protesting the bailouts. Yeah, I think they just, they instinctively know something's fishy here and this isn't right. And the average guy's getting ripped off. Whereas I think Krugman's the one intellectually justifying the bailouts and all that stuff. But what's funny is, or not funny, but perverse. It's not merely that So yeah, a wealth tax, that's a bad idea, just in terms of standard economics, public finance, all that stuff. Taxing wealth as opposed to other types of ways to raise revenue is a horribly inefficient way to do it. That you're deadening the incentive to save and invest. And yeah, and under just about any model, that's a bad thing to do if you're going to take into account the future. You don't want to destroy the incentives for people to save and invest. Why would you do that? And so for Krugman just to dismiss that, I just want to read this line again. The way Krugman is saying taking 2% annually as a wealth tax. So again, I want to encourage the listeners to really think that through. It's not a 2% income tax. It's saying what your wealth is, period. Your net worth is, if it's above 50 million, they're doing 2% of that annually. Okay. So that could be a huge number depending on how much you have. And the way Krugman's going to diffuse that and say, no, that's not the reason these people are upset, is he says, for the only people who would be directly affected by her tax proposals are those who more or less literally have more money than they know what to do with. Having $1 million or $2 less wouldn't crimp their lifestyles. Most of them would barely notice. So, that type of argument, that you could justify just about anything with that. That's something you would expect from someone who hasn't studied economics, who doesn't think on the margin. I know this line is used a lot, but literally, if a student in an intro economics class put that answer down, I would think, I'm not getting through to this kid. This kid doesn't know how to think like an economist. And yet that's what Paul Krugman is writing in this column. So it's really amazing. As I've said before, Brian, you may have heard on some of these podcast episodes, that if you didn't know any better, a lot of these columns, you wouldn't think Krugman was an economist at all. You would just think he was just some normal pundit that the New York Times had to rail against Republicans. So but where I'm going with all this is it's not merely that it's bad economically, but ironically, the truly powerful people, and we don't need to say who it is, I know people have different views and stuff, but clearly there are some powerful people behind the scenes who have a lot of influence on what happens. And that, the average person thinks it's, a bill is introduced in Congress and then it goes over to the Senate. And that's a very naive, shallow understanding of what's really causing the agenda or driving the agenda. And those people, they benefit from taxes like this, right? So like the Carnegies and Rockefellers and people like that, they were in favor of the federal income tax because they already had their fortunes. They were already on top. And that was the way a progressive income tax was the way to keep up and coming people from challenging their supremacy. And they say, they would set up trusts and so forth where their money was safe and locked up in things where the income tax wasn't hitting it. So, I don't know. Do you have anything to say? I know I just gave you a bunch of word salad there.
Well, no, I think you're exactly right. One thing you mentioned there with the Gilded Age, again, you're looking at these ultra wealthy. That's the way it always works. You look at Teddy Roosevelt was praised for, say, for example, signing the Pure Food and Drug Act. or the Meat Inspection Act. And what these things ultimately did, and you bring up the income tax, it does the exact same thing. It creates a lack of competition. All the big meatpacking players could afford the regulations that came out of the Meat Inspection Act, but none of the small guys could. So it drove them all out of business. I worked in the tobacco industry. A lot of people know this, but for 3 years, I was a tobacco salesman. So not only am I terrible because I'm considered to be on the right, but I'm terrible because I also sold tobacco. So, I mean,
can I ask you, what do you mean? Like, at what level, in what capacity? I don't know what you mean.
I was at retail and wholesale. So I didn't get out there, and do and we're going to have tobacco, but all this kind of stuff and selling the leaves themselves. But, I did retail and wholesale accounts. So, I would go to wholesale distributors and try to get them to carry our products. I would go to retail accounts and try to get them to carry our products. So it was a lot of hustling, but, when I got in that industry, of course, this is the early 2000s, and they had something called the Master Settlement Agreement that was just signed by all the major tobacco companies. And what it essentially did was make Philip Morris the number one tobacco company from now and forever, because it restricted how you could market the products, how you could merchandise the products, how you could get products into stores. And it created a price scale that actually drove the cost of cigarettes up. So if you had a cheap cigarette, of course, more people are going to buy it. They don't want to pay $7 for a pack of Marlboros, but they might go out and pay $3 for a pack of USA Golds, right? And then there are all these other little companies. This is actually really interesting. It's something as someone who's interested in free market economics would be interested in studying. But you had all these companies come in that did not sign that settlement agreement, and they were selling cigarettes for like $1 a pack. Mm-hmm. So all the people that signed it, which I work for a company that did, we're having to fight and scrape to get some shelf space and signs out. And then you have all these companies come in that didn't sign it, like, well, hell, we didn't sign that thing. We're going to sell it for whatever we want to. We don't have to pay into this settlement to cancer victims. So we're just going to go out and sell it for $1 a pack, put our signs everywhere we want, and it doesn't matter. And those companies came in and just cleaned up. So it was funny how that settlement was designed to drive out the little guy. And even when these companies came in, all the larger companies would start to put pressure on the states to try to regulate that stuff and clamp down on these people. And when they got to a certain market share, they then had to pay into the settlement. It was amazing to see all that was working. But you're right about this income tax and how that works and how it locks out people underneath. And certainly that's always the design when you're at the top there and you get this legislation that you want in the progressive era. It's to keep competition from undermining your position.
Right. And I mean, so one of the phrases economists use on this stuff is Baptists and bootleggers. And that refers to a famous article to understand the political economy of it. So they're like, originally that phrase was deployed for alcohol prohibition and to say like who are the supporters of it. And so you had the Baptists, meaning the people who for moralistic reasons wanted to outlaw alcohol. But then the bootleggers, meaning, the people who were surreptitiously making it and selling it on the black market, they also wanted the maintenance of prohibition because they couldn't survive an open competition with big established companies, making beer and wine and so forth. But they could certainly benefit from making moonshine. They like that operation. And so it just, again, shows you there's different coalitions. And so, yes, especially too, I mean, there's phrases like they'll use like when big companies are sending lobbyists to Washington and they know there's going to be regulation. Like, for example, with a lot of like I'm in the energy sector. I do a lot of consulting work there. And so there's some big companies that like ExxonMobil might come out and be in favor of a carbon tax. And so, is it all of a sudden that they saw the light and now they stopped being deniers and now they understand how science works? Well, no, but they made a calculation. They made a bunch of investments in natural gas. And if there's a carbon tax in place, natural gas will get an advantage over coal in terms of producing electricity. So, there's things like that's partly what drives this stuff. And another, like the Sarbanes-Oxley increase in, financial accounting and the reporting you had to do. Large companies were in favor of that for the same reason you said, Brian, that they could handle the administration. They already had whole legal teams and whatever. It was more, up and coming companies that were going to challenge their dominance. Those are the ones that would get wiped out by these new regulatory burdens. And so it's an interesting way that existing corporations work hand in hand with the state, or even under FDR in the New Deal that Krugman, loves. There were cartelization agreements. And in my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression in the New Deal, I have all sorts of anecdotes in there saying how, like you were saying, Brian, like with the tire companies, like they would come to an agreement and set a minimum price and you couldn't undercut them. And so that meant, what is it? Firestone, I think, was like the national brand at the time.
Right.
So that would guarantee their market share, right? Because if you're some mom and pop organization selling no-name tires, other things equal, people are going to go with the national brand where they can get servicing no matter where they go around the country. But the way you get, the way you sell and challenge and compete against them is you undercut them with price. But that was literally illegal, under the New Deal. So these are all examples of that phenomenon. Let me ask you, Brian, I like this line Krugman says, if Warren is the nominee, then a significant number of tycoons will indeed go for Trump. Better to put democracy at risk than to countenance a challenge to their imperial self-esteem. So something about this really bothers me where we're going to remove the democratically elected president, through impeachment in order to save democracy.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? The hyperbole and, of course, the hypocrisy is dripping through this thing. One of the other lines, that's a great line. One of the other ones where he says that Trump was warning a civil war. Now, I have a problem with this phrase for this reason. Nobody understands nuance anymore. I'm sure you saw on Twitter when Trump tweeted that there was from the minister that we could have a civil war-like fracture. So he never said we're going to have a civil war. He just said that if you impeach the president and remove him, we're going to have a civil war-like fracture, meaning that the factions in America are never going to get along. We're just never going to see eye to eye. If you do this, it's going to create a massive political problem. He never said we're going to have a civil war. And in fact, when he was interviewed afterwards, Jeffries, I think his name was, he said, that's what I meant. I meant that we have a culture war in America. And if you remove the president, it's going to make it worse. He didn't say we're going to shoot at each other, but this is exactly what Krugman says. Warnings of a civil war. Trump is somehow warning of a civil war. When did he do that? The hyperbole and, of course, saving a democracy by removing the president who is elected the way the president's elected by the Electoral College. I mean, it's just hilarious how these people can't get around all the things they're saying that are inconsistent. But there's no accountability for these people. They can say whatever they want. And because I think they do dominate still, even though there's all the alternative media, there's podcasts and there's all these cable television shows and talk radio, but they still do dominate the essential mainstream elements of American media and society. And so they can get away with whatever they want. And they can say things like that. Krugman's writing for the New York Times. I mean, my gosh, the New York Times is the paper. I remember when I was in as an undergraduate, I was reading the Washington Times. And I said to a professor who's a Marxist, I said, I was reading the Times the other day, and he said, well, which Times? And I told him the Washington Times, and he said, that's not really the Times. There's no newspaper but the New York Times. And this is how people think a lot of times. And so they have a monopoly on these things, and they just don't. There's no accountability because of that.
The other thing too, Brian, just to follow up on the impeachment and democracy and stuff, I've seen people argue. So it was actually this guy, Will Wilkinson, who I don't know. He's like a left libertarian, I believe. I don't know if he still calls himself libertarian. At one point, for sure, he was left libertarian. I don't know if he calls himself that anymore. But he had a thing where he said, it used to be the Democratic position was, and I think he quoted Beto talking about it. This is like several months ago saying, hey, well, we have an election coming up. Asking him, do you think we should impeach Trump? And he was, saying, oh, well, we got an election coming up. Why don't we just let the American people decide it there? But now with this whole Ukrainian thing, and it's like, okay, because the American people are waiting on the edge of their seat to see what the Ukrainian government thinks about Joe Biden. And that's really, you know what I mean? Right. Like just the utter contempt. And also with all this stuff, it's hilarious to me. We do know that there were foreign government officials making stuff up to try to discredit and influence the U.S. election, namely the former British intelligence officer who just made up all kinds of crap about Trump that Hillary Clinton's or the DNC or whoever paid for. So that's an example of, someone tampering, foreign elements tampering with the U.S. election. That's fine. But the idea that, the Ukrainian government might look into some stuff that clearly was shady, at least on the surface. You know what I mean? Like it's funny to me that the way Trump meddles with U.S. elections is he allows accurate reporting of things, bad things that either Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden's son did. That's amazing to me that's the treason that, oh, wait a minute, American people don't need to know all this information.
Well, did you see, speaking of the Ukrainian thing, of course, the Democrats have released the text. There were a bunch of texts between ambassadors and other public officials in the Trump administration about the Ukraine. Have you seen this report yet?
I don't think so.
Well, they have the text out there, and the last paragraph is the president wants to make clear that there is no quid pro quo. He's not doing anything he's not withholding military funding for anything. He just wants to ensure that they investigate corruption. So their entire position is there's quid pro quo, there's things going. But here it is from a text, from a policy standpoint, from an official in the Trump administration, before any of this happened. Mm-hmm. And so back in September, there's no quid pro quo. If the Ukrainians thought that's not what the president is doing, essentially. He hasn't ever insisted that at all. So it blows up their entire position. But yet, you've got Krugman writing this stuff, and people still, there's no accountability. They can just say whatever they want. You can say that there's, Jewish billionaires that should vote for Democrats. You can say that, there's a civil war, promoting a civil war, whatever it is, and you can just get away with it. I find Krugman to be extremely boring in that way, because you're right. He is simply just some type of New York Times pundit. There's not really much going on here other than hyperbole most of the time. It's actually sad that this guy has so much influence over American economics, because he's not acting like that, as you said.
Right. And by the way, just to the normal disclaimer I say on this stuff, Krugman is a very good mathematical, neoclassical economist when he wants to be. Right. So that's partly why Tom and I started this thing, is that he's not some lightweight pushover. It's just on this. I mean, I guess in his defense, or to explain it, you'd be hard pressed to explain why taxing wealth at 2% annually is a good idea economically. You know what I mean? I don't know that you'd be able to even invent some set of assumptions, even in a liquidity trap. I'm pretty sure that's a bad idea. Well, maybe not, I guess if breaking windows is a good idea, why would taxing wealth be a bad idea? But, right. It's funny with all the Ukraine stuff, since we're here talking about current events at this point, let me just spout off for a second. So I understand what you just said, Brian, and I'm sympathetic to people who say, "Oh, give me a break. You're so naive. Do you really think Trump's going to come out and literally say, you do this or we're going to withhold the funding?" And so number one is, there's tapes of like Richard Nixon saying stuff, you know what I mean? Like, it's not unheard of for people to be that direct.
Right.
But also it's funny because they'll make, allusions to The Godfather, and, they'll say like, "Oh, it'd be a shame if something were to happen here." And number one, I don't remember Don Corleone ever talking like that. You know what I'm saying? Like he didn't engage in euphemism to shake people down. It was stuff like Luca Brasi would say to that guy, put the contract in front of him and say, either your brains or your signatures on this contract. That's right. Pretty explicit. There's no reading in between the lines there. And also, but where he was a bit vague is, and I didn't go and review the scene here to remember, fresh my memory, but remember when they're having the truce, all the families come together? Yes. And he's like, "I'm a very suspicious man, and paranoid. If my son Michael comes back and there's a plane crash, then no, I forgive nothing." So when he's defending his son and saying, if something is to happen to my son, then there's going to be retribution. So if anybody, we're going to liken it to The Godfather, it's Joe Biden talking about his thing. Exactly right. And so go ahead.
I was just thinking that as you said it. I mean, you're right, because you got the Biden son out there in Ukraine, and if you don't do this, we're not going to give you $1 million. Now, do you remember several years ago, in talking about quid pro quo and what's going to happen? Of course, 1797, you had the XYZ affair where the United States can't even talk to the French without paying the French. So this almost started a war, right? But then several years ago,
I don't even know what you're talking about. I'm just going to admit that. What are you talking about?
Okay. In 1797, the United States sent a diplomatic delegation to France to try to release the United States from any diplomatic obligations of the French government. We had all these treaties because of the American War for Independence. So John Adams sends all these guys over, and when they get to France, you've got the Directory, which is Talleyrand. And he says, "You know what? If you want to talk to us, give us some money." So it becomes a huge international scandal. It's called the XYZ affair. And it started the quasi-war with France. We're fighting the French without a declared war. And it was a big deal, right? So, but several years ago, the Obama administration, I can't remember what country it was, but they essentially said the exact same thing. If you want to talk to us, you're going to pay us. So that was a quid pro quo. It's on tape, and I think it was an Eastern European country, but I can't remember which one. And I tried to go back and find it, and I'm having a hard time finding it. But there was evidence. It's on tape an Obama administration official saying, to talk to us, you got to pay us. Now, this stuff goes on.
It's kind of a racist accusation you're bringing up here.
Well, it is, I know. But it was, according to the left, it would be. But this is true. I mean, this actually happened. So for Trump to get on and there's no look. I've read the transcripts. I've done all that. And if there was something there, then I would freely admit it. I'm not one who defends executive power. I wrote an entire book bashing virtually every sacred cow president in American history, and the right hated me for that. When I go after George Washington, people get very upset. Mm-hmm. But the funny thing is that it's a big nothing burger. There's nothing here for impeachment. So when Krugman, going back to Krugman, when he makes these accusations, this kind of stuff he throws it against the wall and it just hits, and people just start saying, oh yeah, Trump advocated a civil war. It's ingenious rhetorically how you can do this stuff. Or we need a wealth tax. People just accept it. Well, we need a wealth tax. What does that mean? I don't know. An income tax. Sounds good. People don't even know, because when you start talking about numbers like that, it's too big for them. They can't conceptualize it. And hey, these rich people should pay more. One thing is, Krugman said, and going back to that statement, how do we know how much these people actually need to live? If they have more money than they know what to do with, how do we know that? Do we have a thing on their brain that decides, little sensors, decides how much money they actually need? How do I know how much money you need? How do you know how much money I need? I might need $1 billion to live. How do we know these things? So this is funny rhetorically to me, because this stuff has been used since the Gilded Age too. When you have the Interstate Commerce Commission and you can't form a monopoly, or the Sherman Antitrust Act, you can't conspire to form a monopoly. Well, how do you know that? How do you know if someone's conspiring to do that? Is this thought police? How do we figure this stuff out?
Yeah, all good points. And it occurred to me I should just maybe drive home. I was so excited to do my Don Corleone impression that I maybe didn't finish the point there, that I'm okay, like you were saying, like if somebody wants to say, look at the transcript in quotation marks, because it was a memo of that call, and say, yeah, I'm reading between the lines, Trump was leaning on the guy. Okay, that's fine. I got no problem with it. But then you have to admit what Biden was bragging about on video at the CFR was also corrupt. So what annoys me is people going, no, Biden didn't even bring up his son. What are you talking about? You know what I mean? Like, give me a break. And because Biden just can't get to sleep at night knowing that there's some corrupt prosecutor in Ukraine, going around like a loose cannon, and Biden just can't abide that. Give me a break. So that's the thing about being consistent. And yeah, what you're talking about here, it's that's sort of what I was getting at with, like, for example, you could say too that, why can't we just have a really high income tax? It's not like these super athletes are gonna, if you're making $1 million as a pitcher, as a prize fighter, heavyweight fighter, even if the income tax in those brackets is 50%, it's not like you're going to do the next best thing, right? You're still going to do it, but you might retire earlier, right? Like if you're the heavyweight champ of the world, you might not fight again after a certain point if the government's taking 50% of it. All right. So again, thinking on the margin, like you're saying, clearly these Wall Street tycoons, even after they make $10 million and they have 10 million, that's what they're quote worth, they still work themselves to death, like literally in the sense that, they give themselves heart attacks or whatever. They die much earlier because of the anxiety and stress of being in that kind of a job. So, you can say that's dumb. And I actually do think for a lot of them, it would be better if they weren't so driven to compete and, get that magic number. But I agree. It's not that we need to have more tuna fish available. That's not what's driving them. But yeah, there's always next level. Oh, I want to get my private jet. Oh, okay. No, I got to get my private island I'll compete this guy, so they're one-upping each other. But the point is, as long as it's in a market economy, that's a good thing. Okay. So if you want to, argue, with the interventionist state and whatever, actually people amassing wealth past a certain point is detrimental. Okay. You can have that argument, but for Krugman just to say they don't need the money, that's such a goofy thing to say.
Absolutely. And again, how do we figure these things out? It's just, it's really asinine is what it is. It comes down to, almost, when Trump is accused of being a populist, you're shading on populist rhetoric right there. And going back to that populist area, things like it's Wall Street against the farmers, it's man over money. This is the stuff that he's using, but he's doing it very subtly. And I think that, and of course, Trump's accused of this, but these people do the exact same thing. And so you have two sides of the same coin. We really are at a point where there's no other way. And this is what I said early on. There's really no other way to think about these things. It's just we're either going to promote the heck out of industry and commerce and finance, and then of course on the other side to say we're going to regulate it. So you got two hands working against the same thing, and it's all tied into this big Hamiltonian mess that's been created in the last 150 years.
Last thing I'll say here, because I know we're running up on the clock here, is it's so clearly what Krugman has done is hitched his wagon to Elizabeth Warren. Now, back when he was praising Hillary Clinton so much, Tom and I'm ashamed to say it didn't even occur to me. We had Lou Rockwell on as a guest once, and he just matter of factly said, "Oh yeah, well Krugman's hoping to get a spot in the Hillary Clinton administration." And I was like, "Oh yeah, of course he is. He's got his money. Because Krugman has a textbook and whatever, and he gives speeches for a lot of money. So Krugman's fine financially. He's won the Nobel Prize. So what else is there? Well, yeah, if he could serve in an administration in some capacity, that would be another feather in his cap, have political power." And so to me, it looks like clearly he thinks, yes, where he would fit in would be in a Warren administration. And what's hilarious to me is, maybe I'm wrong, but I think if Warren gets the nomination, Trump is going to blow her out of the water in the general election.
Absolutely.
Just because they're personalities. I mean,
yes.
I mean, as Dave Smith, I don't know if you listen to him, but he always mentions, Trump's not afraid to just call her Pocahontas on Twitter. I mean, no one else would have the temerity to do that. Trump doesn't care. You know what I mean?
No, it's fine. This is why it's the age of Trump. I mean, I said on Twitter, look, historians will go back to this period and they call it the age of Jackson. This is going to be the age of Trump. I mean, he really is setting things up differently for the future. And you're right. He will call her Pocahontas to her face. The funniest thing is when Trump comes out yesterday and says right on the South Lawn, China should investigate the Bidens. It's absolutely hilarious. He knows how to troll everybody, and nobody can do it better. I mean, here's a 70-plus-year-old guy that can do this better than millennials. He knows how to get to people, and it's hilarious. And yes, the debates between Warren and Trump would be must-see TV because it would be one-liner zinger after another. Now, I know that he would probably advise not to do it because then people would say, well, he's mansplaining, he's being aggressive, he's taking on, he's belittling this woman. But I don't think Trump cares. He's just going to go do it, and people will laugh. And Warren is a comic figure in a lot of ways. And I just think you're right. If she's against Trump in 2020, she gets annihilated in the general election. And there's no way that Warren wins. So we'll see what happens. I might be entirely wrong, but I agree with you 100% that Trump wins that election hands down.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we could come with wealth, the economy, but even if there's an economic crash, which by the way, I think is going to happen before then, I think people just instinctively, who do you want running the show? This guy who's total alpha male dominating the thing, or this, but actually, well, and according to this white paper, what we found was, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm not even saying it's rational. I'm just saying in terms of who wins popularity contests, like, the bully picking on some kid and the kid's like, giving a good zinger and the bully just pulls his pants down. The class is going to go, and they're going to say who won that exchange the bully did, right. So I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that Krugman seems to keep hitching his wagon to the people that are going to lose the popularity contest. And yes, we know, folks, Hillary Clinton got more votes than Trump did. I understand that. All right. Well, Brian, thanks so much for helping me out here as Tom dallies around the world and, shirks his responsibilities.
It must be nice, isn't it?
Yeah, must be. He's got more money than he knows what to do with, that guy, Tom Woods.
That's Jeez. It. Look, you should start telling him that. You want a wealth tax on Tom Woods because he has more money. But how much money, Tom, do you really need, right? You should start. Krugman's your guy. Now, because I'm siding with Krugman on this. You need to get home and start working again.
Exactly. So the guest, folks, has been Brion McClanahan. You can catch him in his own podcast, The Brion McClanahan Show. He's also at Liberty Classroom. So go to libertyclassroom.com to subscribe. I've got some lectures there, and so does Tom, if you haven't done that already. If you want to see the links for this episode, it's contrakrugman.com/207. And we will see you next time, everybody.
Thanks for listening to Contra Krugman. Subscribe to the show for free on iTunes or Stitcher at contrakrugman.com. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, our blog, books by Tom and Bob, and more at contrakrugman.com. See you next week.